You're listening to the best, the bravest. Interviews with the FDNY's elite. Tonight's show is a bit of a long-term project because I've wanted it to happen for a long time, and for different reasons it hadn't been able to. But tonight, finally, we get my guest who I'll introduce in a little bit. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 248 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Good to have you with us on this Friday evening for what will be volume 38 of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. The previous show was volume 31 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's emergency service unit. And that was with Andy Burchad, who, in addition to his time in the NYPD, 95 to 2022, 20 of those years in ESU, 2002 to 2022. He also has been very successful in the private sector. He owns Flying Aces Consulting, and he talked about that too. So interesting guy, interesting life. And he's going full throttle. And I'll see Andy next Thursday, as a matter of fact, at Citi Field for an event that he talked about on this program involving, again, threat assessment, threat mitigation, and threat awareness. As always, of course, we'll go through the sponsors real quick, and we'll get to tonight's guest in a moment. Of course, we have to pay the bills, as we always like to joke about on this show. And first things first, my consulting company, as always. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. One thing before I get to the other ads that I do want to add is that I meant what I said at the end of that, which is I don't charge an arm and a leg. Price is up to you. Price is negotiable if you feel you need my services. So, like I said, meant what I said there. And next, of course, Billy Ryan, co-executive producer and creator of Tales from the Boom Room, one of the miniseries we have on this show, profiles the NYPD's arson, explosion, and bomb squad, his private investigation firm, the Ryan Investigative Group. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the arson and explosion squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike the New Haven podcast. One more to go through, of course, that's if you need a PI, and if you need a lawyer, well, Joe Murray. If you're ever caught on the wrong end of the law, call Joe Murray. Joe's a retired NYPD police officer turned criminal defense attorney. With 15 years of experience in the NYPD from 1987 until 2002, he parlayed a successful career in the NYPD into an equally successful career as a criminal defense attorney. His website is jmurray-law.com, where you can reach him at 646-838-1702, or just email him at joe@jmurray-law.com. Okay, we took care of all these sponsors for this evening. Thanks to Bill and Joe, as always, for supporting the show. And I see all you in the chat early on. Darren Phillips, Aaron Cook, Jay Driscoll, William Cooney, Lieutenant Pete Pranzo. Thank you for being here. My next guest, for close to 33 years with two separate agencies, enjoyed the best of both worlds as a police officer, first with the New York City Police Department for almost a decade, and later firefighter and fire officer with the New York City Fire Department. He came on originally to the NYPD in 1985 and then rolled over after 8 years in the PD to the FDNY in 1993, particularly making his name in HazMat, where for 16 years, just about 16 years, he'd lend his expertise both locally and abroad on all things hazardous materials. And that, for another volume of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. He's a guy I've been trying to get on the show for a long time, and that is retired FDNY Lieutenant Paul Rogers. Paul, welcome. How are you?
Hey, Mike. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. We've talked about this for a while, like we were talking about before the show came on the air, and finally you're here. You were on Getting Salty a little while ago, and now I get to have you for volume 38 of the best, the bravest. So tell me about, before we get into the PD and the FD tonight, where'd you grow up, Paul?
I grew up in the East New York area, Ozone Park in East New York. I actually grew up in Ozone Park, but it was right on the borderline of East New York there. Grant Avenue. I went to school in Grant Avenue. in that particular area. It's a tough neighborhood at the time. Still is a tough neighborhood.
Oh yeah, it has that reputation for sure. Forgot to mention, if I mentioned this already, I apologize for the redundancy, but you got a question for Paul, fire away in the super chat. It's there. So if you want to submit a question that way, that's the way to go if you would like. So tell me, were you the kind of guy that had a specific preference in terms of civil service? Did you not care which agency you went to? Did you even have an interest in civil service?
Actually, no. I was actually in college. I was in college for engineering. I was out in Stony Brook. I was doing pretty well. I took the police department test as a fluke. You know, my father was a police officer. My brother was a police officer. And I had friends that were police officers. So I took it just as a backup. And then my father wound up getting sick and passing away of cancer. He was sick while I was in school. I came home because, you know, I couldn't deal with it. And sure enough, I wound up going on the NYPD because I just couldn't get my head on straight focused for my engineering, which was a good thing because I landed in a good spot. I was happy about that I went over to the PD. I didn't think that I was going to do that. I went over to the PD, and then I went over to fire after that. But I enjoyed both jobs. I really enjoyed both of them.
Right. 8 years, like we said, when I was introducing you in the NYPD from 85 to 93. Back then they had the NSUs. So you get out the academy, you don't go to housing, you don't go to transit, you go to city, which was the preferable destination for any recruit at that time. Although those that went to housing and transit learned to love it with time. So where was your, back then they still had the NSUs in 85. So where was your first NSU located?
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that they used one test at that time, and they used to pick from that one test where you're going. So you never really knew where you were going when you actually were going into the academy. But anyway, I wound up going to the NYPD, like you said, and I went to NSU 2, which is right there at the academy, and we were detailed constantly down to the 9th precinct. For Operation Pressure Point at that particular time.
Fighting Ninth, which had a reputation back in the 80s. So tell me, I mean, you're working the 9th during the 80s. That's in the Manhattan area. Another tough neighborhood. You grew up in a tough neighborhood. This was a tough neighborhood back then. Tell me about, Operation Pressure Point. For my audience that may not understand what that was, what was the goal of that operation during a time when crime was way out of control in the city?
Yeah, so they were trying to clean up the city. And down in Alphabet City, they really wanted to change things over. So what they would do is they would flood the area with cops. And you would have either a 1 or 2 block post, and you would have an adjoining post right next to you. And they just flooded that area with constant police officers walking the streets. And it was actually boring, especially in the winter time when it was really, really cold out. And they did not want you to go inside and take any breaks. And we had some pretty tough sergeants. We had some really good sergeants, but there was one particular sergeant that was really tough. And he went out there just trying to look to get you. And I didn't think that was cool. I didn't think that was cool.
No. There's
cold out there.
Exactly. Especially those New York winters. There's keeping the men sharp, and then there's just belittling them, and that's a fine line. Some sergeants know how to walk that well. Some sergeants don't. Tell me about, listen, I know we've talked and you said, well, listen, not that much happened in my 8-year career, but every cop makes a good arrest, of course, especially if he or she's an active one. Any notable arrests in that period that stick out?
I actually had a couple, but I think the one that police officers that were on the job while I was on the job may remember it because it was part of training. I walked in on a robbery. I was on a foot post. I walked in on a robbery in a doctor's office. They had just held the doctor's office up, but I didn't know at the time. And some guy comes out of the doctor's office. He looks at me. I look at him, and he gets into like a crouch. I thought maybe he had something wrong with him, like a stomach ache or something like that. The next thing you know, I go to say, hey, you all right? And he whips out a gun right to my head. And I wound up wrestling him with the gun with him. We went from inside the vestibule out into the street. I didn't have a radio at the time. We were short with radios. We were going through a transition where the radios just weren't working properly. So they would just tell you, hey, you can't stay in the house. You have to actually go out there and make a phone call. And every hour you would actually make a phone call to let them know you're okay. But you had no radio, and you couldn't really answer jobs either because you had no radio. There was no
Right, you didn't know
communication.
what was going on.
So anyway, we wrestled out into the street. Make a long story short, I was about a half a block from the precinct, right in Gramercy Park. The 13th precinct was right down the block there. That's where I was assigned. And, they're in the middle of changing tours. And the day tour is getting off, the 4 to 12 is getting on, and they're getting numerous calls for a 1013, which is, helping a cop. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, they showed up. First person that showed up, I was all bloodied up because we were hand-to-hand combat. And I was all bloodied up. The first one to show up was a sergeant, Sergeant Gibbons. He showed up and he looked at me and he looked at the guy, and they thought I was shot. They threw me in the back of a car. Next thing you know, I'm getting transported to Bellevue Hospital, and they're telling them over the air that I'm shot in the head because I had a lot of blood on my head. I remember it was a gentleman named Eddie Mullen and Eddie Hennessy were the two officers that wound up taking me to the hospital. And I told them in the car, it's like, hey guys, I'm not shot. They're like, oh no, you're shot. You got blood. You just don't know it. Anyway, that was pretty alarming at that particular time. It was a newspaper article, and a lot of people called me up, and life went on.
Oh yeah, no, of course.
And life goes on, yeah.
Yeah, close call there. Close call.
Mike, let me one last thing. This guy was this guy was a bad dude. He was wanted by the robbery squad, the Queens robbery squad. He would basically go into doctors' offices, geriatric doctor's office. He would, where people can't defend themselves, he would hold them up. Yeah, and he would steal all their belongings, and then he'd be on his way. And that's exactly what he was doing in this situation too.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you telling me that story a while ago off the air, and hearing it now. I mean, and those extra details is like, man, that's it. And a lot of cops were getting killed back then, especially by gunfire. So, I mean, that's a very close call. And just to stay on that real quick before I move on, you have a close call like that. You're wrestling with someone who wants to kill you mentally, if anything at all. What did that do to you?
Yeah, you definitely looked at life differently. You were. By the way, that the gun misfired. Mm-hmm. A revolver actually misfired. That's pretty hard to do.
Right.
So I guess I'm lucky to be here because I was looking right down the barrel of the gun when, the gun misfired. But yeah, you definitely think of life a little bit differently, and you get to enjoy your life. But yeah, but Mike, I never hold on to things. I kind of have to let it go. I don't dwell on it and just move on. And that's exactly what I did with that.
No, that's the right way to approach it, of course. We're talking with Lieutenant Paul Rogers, Best of the Bravest Interviews with the FDNY's Elite, Volume 38 of this miniseries. He originally, like I said in the introduction, started his career in the city of New York as a New York City police officer. Real quick, before I get to your FDNY years and making that switch in 93, considering where you ended up doing heavy, grunt work with the fire department, 13th Precinct, one truck ESU is right there. Was there a brief thought about maybe putting in for ESU?
I did think about it. I always looked at those guys as the elite. I really did. They were definitely sharp. They were sharp. I knew a lot of guys that left the 13th precinct to go across the floor, as we say in the fire department, but over to one truck. John Brown being one of them, Barry Nagelberg, and some of these guys actually went to bomb squad.
Yep, Barry
Dave
Nagelberg.
Buckowitz, Patty O'Connor. But I knew a lot of them. A lot of really good, sharp guys, and nice guys too. Really, really decent men. Yeah. No, but it seemed as though the 13th precinct was like a breeding ground where they would have the inn. At least when I was there, they would have the inn where these guys would just go across and wound up going to Truck One, which was great for them.
Oh yeah, Buckowitz and Nagelberg and O'Connor, of course, like you said, ended up in the bomb squad. There's a great picture of them that the old CO of the squad, Jerry Sheehan, sent me. It's like August of 01, right before 9/11, and those three guys that you just mentioned are in the picture. Brian McInerney, who was, and if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I apologize sincerely to you, Brian. He's a big fan of this show, and he knows you well. He mentioned that in the promos regarding your gun incident. He's like, I remember when that happened.
Yeah. I know Brian. She's since young kid. We actually swam on a swim team together. We had a summer place up in the Poconos. Yeah, good guy, Brian. Hey, Brian, how you doing?
Good to see you, Brian. Small world, man. Because when he said that, he's like, "I've known Paul since we were kids." It's literally exactly what he said. I'm like, "Oh wow," So it's interesting how, like I said, even though with a big city like New York, there's a small little connection like that. So 1993, you got 8 years on by this point. When did your mind start churning to go to the fire department? What made you want to do that rollover?
As weird as this may sound, it was a difficult decision. It wasn't just, hey, I'm going. I hate this job. I never had that. I actually didn't mind what I was doing. I was on the sergeant's list to get promoted. So I really thought about maybe staying, but a couple people talked to me and said, listen, just go over to the fire. If you don't like, you can always come back. And that's how I addressed it. I went over to fire to see how it was. And when you're kind of, what you're doing with the NYPD, you know what you're doing every day. Now you go into fire, it's a whole different world.
Right.
So you're kind of uncomfortable. And I was saying to a couple of guys in the firehouse, like, geez, I don't know if this is for me. And they're like, don't worry about it. It gets better. And it wound up getting really, really good. And I'm so happy I stayed. I'm so happy I stayed with the FDNY. Had a great time.
Oh yeah, it was a great decision for you. You did a lot, as we'll chronicle tonight as we go. So before you got to HazMat, what was your first company?
Yeah. So another thing in the fire department, I really didn't know anyone. I had no connections. I was just, hey, Paul Rogers he's a transfer over from the NYPD. So I didn't know anyone. So I went to a place in Queens where the overtime was high at the particular time. So they were trying to send some of us over to Queens. Some people had connections and went, to busy places. I went to like a middle of the road, a single engine company with a battalion in Flushing, Queens, in engine 274, which is now ironically a HazMat tech engine.
Really? So you're starting out there in 274 in Queens. You mentioned middle of the road. Any decent amount of jobs that came in? Was it touch and go there, or was it a quiet house?
The nice thing about 273 was the next company over. They did a lot of EMS work, and they ran a lot. I can tell you, when we went out the door, we were doing work, and we did a lot of second-due work to 273 and 129. And actually, we got some pretty good jobs. We definitely got some pretty good jobs. Also being, private dwellings when we were first due, because there was a lot of private dwellings there. But 273 and 129, there was a lot of multiple dwelling fires that we had, and it was a very compact area down there. A lot of Asian community down there, and you go into a fire and you can have 10 people in a small little apartment. You could have 15 people in a small little apartment. You would be amazed how many people come out of that. So the searches were very difficult because there was a lot of stuff there when you were going in to do a search, and even moving the line, it was tough. It was kind of tough. But everyone has their tough problems in their particular area. But that was a very crowded area.
Yeah. Keep in mind also, there's a lot of immigration going on. People are coming through the ports. So, a lot of people are coming in and staying with relatives, and that kind of augments the problem to where you understand why they're coming over. But in a situation like that, it's kind of like, I don't even know what analogy to use. It's just difficult. As you said, I guess that's the right word to sum it up. It's just very, very difficult. But it makes for good training, I guess, on the fly, quite literally, if you will, trial by fire.
Yeah. And, 274, as I said, was a middle of the road company, but we trained constantly.
Mm-hmm.
We had a captain. He was a great guy. And we had guys in the firehouse that just absolutely loved training. I mean, we would do the life-saving rope, which is very unusual for an engine company. I don't think they've ever done one, to do a life-saving rope rescue. But we would put that life-saving rope on once a week. Of course, you had to inspect it once a week, but we'd always play around with that thing. It was good. We drilled a lot, which I loved. I loved drilling.
Yeah, no, and that bodes well, especially down the road when you became a fire officer, as we'll touch on. You got to stay sharp. You got to make sure the equipment's working in the first place. But, it may seem redundant to some, I guess we're going to do this again. But when that actual call comes in and it's the real deal, you fall back on it. It becomes muscle memory. Before we proceed, just a quick shout out to the chat. Some people have tuned in. My brother-in-law's here, as is my sister. Thanks, guys, for watching. CDM 2065 and Joe Maliga, retired correctional officer up in Rochester, is tuning in. tonight. On a quick side note before I proceed with your FDNY career, and I remember asking this to Peter Blake, our mutual friend who was on the show previously last year. Same thing. He rolled over from NYPD into FDNY. Same, it's civil service, same field in the sense that you're helping people, different ways of doing that. The mindset of a cop is dramatically different than the mindset of a firefighter. So altering your mindset to thinking like a fireman as opposed to thinking like a cop, how long did that take you?
Well, actually, it didn't take me too long. You know, going back to my time in the PD, when I was with the NYPD, I was put into a unit. I was voluntold to go into a brand new unit that was just being formed in the NYPD called CPOP.
Yep.
CPOP was just being formed. They had one in the 13th precinct. They didn't have them throughout the city yet. It was one of the first ones to have them. And I was told on Monday, you're going to be starting in CPOP because they didn't want, guys wanted to be in the car. They wanted to have a partner, and this was a foot post. And all you were doing is going out and making friends with the community to try to gather intelligence to try to stop crime and find out where crime is and to try to clean things up and doing reports and stuff like that. So I was used to, from a good rapport with the community, right? Everyone was usually happy to see me. Oh, here he comes, and some people looked at you weird when you'd first go in and try to introduce yourself. But he got me out there speaking to a lot of people, and I didn't mind it. At first, I wasn't very happy that I got drafted to that, as part of the 9 squad chart. But then after I started to do some work in it, and you had weekends off, and you had all these extra vacation days, they called them chart days. I said, wow, this is not so bad.
No, not at all. Not at all. And that was something that the housing police, the old housing police, had instituted years ago with community policing, and the NYPD adapted it. It became a great thing for a long time, and it still is. There's a lot of good work being done with CPOP to this day. Back to the FD, as you said earlier, kind of alluded to it, medical runs are picking up because CFRD runs are becoming a part, even before the merger with EMS, CFRD runs are becoming part of the fold in terms of response. And it's helping because I remember Commissioner Safer mentioning this to me on this program last summer. Prior to the FDNY picking up CFRDs, they had the worst mortality rate for matters of life and death, such as heart attacks, strokes, things of that nature. Now, because of the fact that it's being added to the workload, lives are being saved. So working with that, some guys, when they first came in and it was first added to the workflow and what you would respond to were against it, some were for it for the reasons I just mentioned. Did you like doing it? You seem like the kind of guy that you enjoyed the CFRDs. Am I wrong?
I didn't mind it. I didn't mind it. It was a brand new world. I do like learning about new stuff, so I embraced it.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know.
Right.
So it didn't bother me. Sometimes you had to deal with some, just kind of raunchy people, but I don't know. Or sometimes you had to deal with some pretty hairy stuff. Legs cut off and other things going on. When we first went online, we didn't know what to expect. And I can tell you my first CFRD run in 274. It comes over, the ticket comes over, and it says, man hanging in the garage. Right? So we're like, man hanging in the garage. So we go there, and there's a man hanging in the garage. We lifted him up. We took him off. He still partially breathing. We started to bag him. Went off to the hospital. I don't know what happened to him after that, but I remember that was my first CFRD call in the FDNY. Was a man hanging in the garage.
Not fun. Yeah, that's not a pretty sight for sure. Sorry I had to see that, but yeah, that's pretty descriptive. At least you know what you're going to. Not that I'm making fun of him, of course. I certainly hope he survived that. But man hanging in garage. Can you go, please? And sure enough, that's what it was. 1998, I mean, by this point, as many guys have told me, and I want to make sure I get this right, 1998 special operations in some form had already existed. This was just the year that the squads came into existence. HazMat had already been in existence for quite some time. It started under Chief Ingram in the early 80s. Did you go to HazMat in 98? When did you get there?
Yeah, I went there in 1999.
Okay.
I originally went there in 1999. There was a captain, Vinny Doherty, who I used to do basketball officiating, Mike, and Vinny used to ref with me all the time. He's like, hey, we need guys. We can't get guys. Mm-hmm. So I love science. I really did. So I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I went over on 60 days, and I actually started to like it. Tremendous amount of overtime, tremendous amount there.
I imagine.
And I couldn't understand how guys who are liked overtime couldn't go to HazMat, but no one, you know, it's a different path in the FDNY. So anyway, my wife was doing with our first child, and it was getting near Y2K, and she couldn't deal with the overtime, and she begged me to go back to try it because she was, you know, she had a tough pregnancy.
Yeah.
So I did. I went. At first, I said to them, like, they said to me, like, hey, why don't you you know, we won't call you for any overtime. Just stay here. So anyway, I went back, and right after 9/11, immediately went back to HazMat after they lost so many people, and so many people retired. There was just so much going on. So I had a little bit of a background already when I was going in there, but I knew all those guys that were killed.
Yeah. Previously, I mean, you mentioned how the opportunity to go into HazMat came about, but it sounded like you were enjoying your time in 274. There was a lot of work or at least a decent amount of work to go around. So if that path had never taken shape, I mean, who knows? You probably still could have became a fire officer. You never know how a career is going to shake out. But if that path, let's say to HazMat, never took shape, were you still looking to move somewhere else, or would you have been content staying in 274?
No, I actually, I hope Al Hagen is listening to this one. Al Hagen from 43, he was captain of 43 truck. I knew a lot of guys up in 43 truck up in Harlem. And, you know, I called the captain as a courtesy, and I said, hey, Cap, I'd like to put in for your house. I'd like to get an interview. He's like, yeah, I'll get you on a list. I'll call you when, you know, when I'm ready for the interview. You know, that was his circular folder. It was a very difficult house to get into. And then I try to get into 37 truck, which is up in the Bronx,
okay,
which had some good fire duty. And, you know, since we were the battalion, Mike, I would go up to the battalion and I would look for any detail out of the battalion. I would grab them all. Even if we had full complement, I'd said, let me go here. I went to Brooklyn. I went everywhere. I took any detail out of the borough or out of the battalion just to see how the rest of the FDNY was about, because I didn't know much about it.
And that's a good attitude to have. The more you know, the more educated you are. And if you have a good attitude, people pick up on that, even in a gruff department like the FDNY, you know, where, yeah, it takes a while to acclimate yourself to the guys, and for the guys to get to know where you're coming from. People do notice things like that. Oh, he's determined. It's not like he's looking to brown nose. He's looking to learn, and they'll take you under your wing anytime.
Yeah, yeah. And that's how I discovered 37 truck. Took a detail there,
right?
And I loved it. I loved it. I wound up staying there on overtime. They said, "Hey, you available to work tonight?" And I said, "Yes." I loved it. It was a great time.
I imagine. We're talking with Paul Rogers. This is volume 38 of the Best and Bravest interviews with the FDNY as a lead. Joe, if I can get to, you know what, I'll just ask the question now. You know the show, Paul. You know Joe Maliga's running joke, I'm sure, with me, which is the baby's question. Did you ever deliver a baby?
I delivered a couple of babies.
There you go. There you go, Joe.
Yeah, right. we went to one at 2-3 o'clock in the morning, lights on in the front, and we go around the back. No one's waving us in. It's a private dwelling. We're like, all right, ringing the doorbell. No one's answering. Finally, this woman answers the door. She answers the door, and right behind her is her husband holding the baby that she just delivered.
Jesus. Wow.
I'm not lying. This is a true statement. I was like, holy cow. The afterbirth hadn't even come out yet. Oh. Well, anyway, I remember one guy, he was a paramedic, and the baby started, we cut the cord, the baby started crying. He goes, crying's good. Crying's good. I remember him saying crying's a good thing. The baby's alive. So, but yeah. Oh, I delivered a couple babies.
Yeah, no, that's not for me. I mean, imagine, me pulling up to something like that. Ma'am, are you okay? I'll take that as a yes. Let me know when you're done. But I mean, that's one tough cookie. The fact that she could, hey, sure, hey, how you doing? Yeah, he's right over here.
Well, we were like, wow, that's some tough husband here, Get the doorbell.
Oh my God. Yeah. Imagine after just giving birth, open the door, please.
Yeah.
Man. That's now that's an only New York story right there. But I'm glad I asked the question, and I'm trying to see what Joe said. What did he? He says very nice. Yeah, there you go, Joe. So that's our running joke, Joe Maliga and I. That original stint in hazmat pre 9/11,
Mm.
the evolution of hazmat. Some things have stayed the same. Some threats are still the same as they were 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago. Some are, as we were talking about off the air, and we'll talk about a little bit later on the air, are different. But back then in 1999, now when people think of hazmat, they think of chemical attacks and the big things. And yes, some of that does happen. But there's also the minor things too. Something as simple as batteries, not lithium-ion, as we'll touch on later, but the conventional day-to-day things that we use in our households or in our job spaces. So back in 1999, 2000, what was the main thing hazmat was focused on?
Believe it or not, we actually did drill on terrorism. There was the sarin release in subways in 1995 in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So it was on their mind. We did some radiation. We were doing radiation drilling and stuff like that. But we would get a mix of a lot of different things. Most of the time, we were called to overturn tractor trailers where we had to take the diesel fuel out of the saddle tanks. That was our bread and butter. But going to laboratories, some of these laboratories, especially in the colleges, they got some pretty exotic chemicals in there. Nitric acid, a big oxidizer, nasty stuff, hydrofluoric acid, all of these different things that can do some serious damage to people. But there's still a lot of stuff all over New York City, and they're inside of those college campuses.
Right. Was public you're seeing a lot now. Commissioner Kavanaugh just announced some new initiatives for it. Was a lot of public education back then being done in terms of these threats to create some public awareness, create some public safety measures?
I don't recall that. No, I don't recall a lot of public messages going out to communities about that. No, I don't recall that.
Maybe because of the commonality of it. I mean, most of those chemicals you mentioned, some of them are, of course, a little bit more on the extreme side. But like I mentioned earlier, there's some things that are day-to-day use. It's tough to regulate that.
Mike, pre 9/11, the fire department, they were using duct tape to hold up everything. They had no money, so I can't see them doing a big, community effort with no money when they had no money to do it.
That's a good point.
We actually begged, borrowed, and stealed for everything as best we could to try to make sure that we could operate safely, even in the firehouse. I remember going to the schools a couple of times and asking the janitors for paper towels. Yeah, paper towels or toilet paper. Not a lot, obviously not a lot, but still, we did not have it.
Yeah, that's tough. And I go back to, again, my conversation with Safer last summer when I guess Rudy had called him and, he mentioned, hey, I'm going to send you over something. Where are you? He gives the location of the firehouse he's at. This is when he's the fire commissioner, of course. And he asked one of the captains at the firehouse, hey, you guys have a fax machine here? Captain starts laughing. Of course we don't. This is 94, 95. And Safer ended up joking with me. He's like, you know what? I wasn't trying to bring the FDNY into the 21st century. I was just trying to bring them into the 20th century. Because of that reason, back then, nothing against PD. You know how much I love PD, but PD got everything back then. FD didn't get anything. They got jack.
No, that's true. Yeah, they didn't get anything.
Yeah. It amazes me how much they were able to do back then with quite literally less. But you touched on something interesting. You're back in hazmat after 9/11. Remember, for those of you that don't know, most of you do because you follow the best and the bravest. And for those of you that follow this mini series in this program, you also follow Getting Salty. So you know how Coobs and Lou have talked about it, which is hazmat 1 is housed with Squad 288. And that firehouse combined lost the most guys on 9/11. I believe it was 11 from hazmat and 8 from 288. So you're going back there. It's a tough time because 288's feeling it too. And I'm sure those guys were quite close. And you knew some of those guys that got killed, as you mentioned earlier. There's also the anthrax threat. There's also more security measures being put in place. But I don't know how much of an involvement you had with the anthrax attacks in October of 01. But if there was any, tell me about hazmat's response to those particular events.
Yeah, Well, first of all, there was later on there wound up being a protocol being put in place, but HazMat at that time were actually running most of those anthrax calls, and the police department was busy doing their thing, securing, because so much going on in New York City. But yeah, we would actually go there to a lot of these things. But Mike, a lot of these things were, you know, hey, there's white powder at a donut shop, or, you know, like just ridiculous stuff. But people would call for the craziest things. I remember them activating all these hammer teams, right? They called them hammer teams, where they would do assessments. And then if they felt that it was a credible, you know, they had a credible assessment, HazMat would show up and start doing some sampling. But these hammer teams were all over the place. So because of the volume of calls, they had all of these things placed in all the different boroughs, where they would just be assigned to that borough, going to all these different white powder calls, they would call them. And we go from there. And then wound up being some protocols that were put in place, which I thought were good, which actually brought down the running for us, which was a good thing for us.
Oh yeah, no, of course, and because it was, I mean, again, as I've talked about with Tales from the Boom Room, of course, for the Bomb Squad miniseries, and ESU as well, and of course, Best of the Bravest. Everyone was, and I love what one of my recent guests had, Steve Lanos from the Bomb Squad. Everyone was seeing ghost, any little thing, and you can understand the paranoia to a degree after the magnitude of what had just occurred. But everyone, you know, any little thing, that's a bomb, that's white powder, that's this, that's that, you know. So that running, you guys were already stressed out enough with the losses you just endured. You're also probably working the pile too. Add those runs on top of that. It's more than someone can take. I don't care how tough you are mentally as a fireman or a cop. That's too much to deal with.
It was a lot. Mike, we were so short with manpower, staffing.
Mm-hmm.
I worked 96 hours straight.
Jeez.
96 hours straight in the firehouse.
Oh my God.
I remember them where between people had to go to funerals, or people had to, you know, there was just, and we would say who's got what, and then we would look at the priority on who would actually get to go home if someone was coming in. Maybe one person was coming in to relieve. Who's going to be leaving on? Who's taking up on that person? I remember that 96 hours straight.
My goodness, it's 4 days in the firehouse.
4 straight days in the firehouse.
Oh my goodness, that is a lot. And it's a tough time. It's a sad time, obviously, for obvious reasons. Well, but you know, even in the tough times, there is some silver linings. When you look back on that late 2001, early 2002 period, are there any positive moments that stick out?
Yeah, there was. It really was a, you know, everyone was very close. There was a lot of camaraderie in the firehouse, and the bickering wasn't really taking place anymore, which was a good thing. And I think everyone truly did look out for each other, because they just lost so many people that we realized, like, hey, life is precious. We could lose you tomorrow. And so that was a good thing that came out. You know, it's funny. A friend of mine does and I'm not plugging his show, but he does this thing called Laughter Saves Lives, and this guy John LaRocchia has a little podcast himself, and he does a lot of charity work, and he's a comedian. And I don't know if you ever heard him, but he's a very funny guy. Mm-hmm. But Tommy Gardner was killed. Tommy was the real comedian. And they had a little practice together, going back and forth. And, you know, John kept up with it. But John actually brought laughter back into the firehouse, where we started laughing again, you know, joking around. And most of the laughs were at him. But yeah. So laughter started to come back in the firehouse, and we started feeling, you know, a little bit more emboldened as a result of that, which was a good thing.
Yeah, of course, you need it. You know, you need it, and eventually that healing process began, and gradually, even though you can never replace those guys, there was that same familial look, that same fun sense. Fun came back to the job, just in a different form. So 2002 is an interesting period for you, because you're 17 years into a civil service career between both departments. You had your 8 years with the NYPD. Now you're 9 years into your time in the FDNY. So more time as a fireman than as a cop. Was this around the time, and correct me if I'm wrong, was this around the time you made lieutenant? 02, 03?
03. I made lieutenant in 03. Yeah, yeah, and you know, with that much time on the job and really 9/11 happening, I never even, you know, I wasn't thinking much about the PD, but I still used to see people when in HazMat, you're going to all these special events and things of that sort. But and I used to see these guys, and I always, you know, always had a good rapport with most of the people with the NYPD, and I mentioned a couple of those guys. Jimmy Moran was another guy.
Yeah, yeah.
I got along with Jimmy. Jimmy called me a friendly Indian. but so yeah, I did really enjoy the FDNY, but I never lost contact with the guys from the 13th precinct. Matter of fact, only last month I was in South Jersey at like a reunion with guys from the 13th precinct that were in CPOP. There were about 5 of us. It was great. It was great to see people.
No, I imagine, yeah, Jimmy Moran. I just saw him down at Floyd Bennett Field, and the guys were telling me, he's like, you don't want Jimmy on the podcast for the ESU miniseries. And I says, why? He's like, it's not that he can't tell great stories. It's that you're going to have a bleep button for days with him. And I'm like, all right, duly noted. You know, that's the benefits of live podcasting, folks. But now at this point, here you are as a lieutenant. You're a fire officer. You've had a unique time working in 274. You had a good fire officer there. You had your experience working in HazMat, both pre and post 9/11. And that's an unusual but a good education for a new fire officer. It gives you a lot more experience, especially for the new challenges that are facing the department. So early on as a fire officer trying to find your footing, when you were first promoted, where were you assigned? And where did you really learn how to be a fire officer?
So yeah, so when I got out of what we call FLIPS, First Line Supervising Program, when I got out of that, I was assigned to Brooklyn. I went to the 5-7 Battalion, which is in Bevitz-Stuyvesant. And I bounced around there for a little while in Brooklyn. And then an opportunity came up. Bob Ingram, chief of HazMat at the time, gave me a call and said, hey, listen, we need a guy. We're going to be ramping up our capabilities in HazMat, meaning the tech engines were going to come. He goes, I need a guy to run the technician school. That's coming offline. So I thought about it and I said, all right, I'll do it. How long do I need to be there? And he said, just do it for a year and we'll get you bouncing around through SOC and into the HazMat itself. I said, okay. So little did I know that 1 year I had to get my replacement. It took me 5 years to get my replacement. But I made the best of it. I mean, during that particular time, my wife and I at the time, we had divorced. And we get along well now. But at that particular time, it was good for me for the kids. So it worked. It's funny. That's when I started to realize, like, you never know why a person is offline. You never know. Guys used to say, oh, they're cowards. And I never really subscribed to that. But then when being offline actually worked for me, I realized the benefits. And I'm like, wow, some people are offline for reasons for their families or something like that. So there's a place for everyone. I can tell you that right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I admire you talking about that because you never know. And Lieb talked about this with me and yesterday on Salty, that it's not just the rigors of the job. That's a big part of it. Some of the stuff you have to see, some of the stuff you have to endure. It's those home moments too. Not everything is rosy at home. Even in the best of families, there's moments sometimes that are challenging. We've all had them. And sometimes that could take its toll. And, if you don't take a step back and kind of get yourself right, not only you're not going to be a good fireman, you're not going to be a good husband, you're not going to be a good dad, not going to be a good brother, not going to be a good friend. So it's important. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. Listen, civil service, I don't care if it's NYPD, FDNY, whatever it may be, when you're working rotating shifts like that, it takes a toll on your family, your kids, your wife, or whatever, your spouse, whoever it may be. It does take a toll on them. And you have to keep that in mind.
Yeah. It's important. It's before you can be as fit physically as you can. Before you can take care of your physical fitness, which is important, taking care of your mental fitness is just as pivotal. in the fire service, and it's being talked about more and more, which is a good thing. Stu Kelsall, I see you, buddy. Good to see you. Don't want you to think I forgot about you. Glad you're tuning in tonight from across the pond in England, as are you too, Jay Driscoll. So, that being said, of course, at this time, it's 2005, 2006 when you get involved with FEMA. And FEMA's had an interesting time overall. I mean, of course, the 90s was very interesting. They had gone down to Oklahoma City. There was efforts in the Dominican Republic after Hurricane George. I'm sure they assisted with 9/11. Katrina had just happened the previous year in New Orleans. And now you're getting involved. So at this point, about a couple years under your belt as a fire officer, you'd worked out in the battalion, as you just alluded to. What piqued your interest in FEMA?
So I figured I would ask about it. I asked Chief Downey, Joe Downey at the time. I seem to have a good rapport with a lot of people, and thank you to Chief Downey. He took a shot at me. He says, "You know what, Paul? I'm going to give you a shot at that." I also had Jimmy Yakimovich in my corner too. So I was in there, and I really enjoyed the training. I love the cross training. Again, this brought me back to some of my peers in the police department. And I still talk to some of those people that I went to Haiti with. We got deployed to Haiti with some of the people from the NYPD. We had a great time down there. Not a great time. We saw some hairy stuff. But you kind of let it all go when you come back to the BOO. The BOO is the base of operations. You come back there at night. The next crew would go out. I had the day shift at that time. And you really saw the camaraderie where everyone got along. You were wearing the same uniform, FEMA uniform from New York City, and of course the chops were, everyone was busting each other's chops and things like that, but all in good fun, and we knew we had each other's back, and I felt really proud about that. I felt really, really good about that everyone got along, because you see sometimes there is some hustles going in the street with the battle of the badges and stuff like that, which I really didn't subscribe to, but that was a aha moment for me, and I made a lot of good friends, people that I didn't know well until you're actually with them for 2 weeks in a rescue effort down in Haiti.
Well, let's spend some time on that, because this is a devastating earthquake. Of course, so much damage was done, so many lives were lost. New York Task Force 1, I'm not putting it on a pedestal above anybody else. Every FEMA task force is important and serves an important mission, I should say. But New York Task Force 1 is unique because it's the only task force that has a law enforcement presence to it in emergency service unit, combined with you guys in the FDNY. So that puts it in a different category for that particular reason. Tell me about the call to go down there, and just you personally, your experiences down there, because you mentioning that, I can't just gloss over that. You know me, Paul.
So I'm working in a firehouse. It's after 12 o'clock, maybe 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'm up doing paperwork. I wasn't very good. I didn't sleep well in the firehouse. I wasn't good at that at all. You run out. So I was more of if I did 24, I was doing the 24. But I get a call, and I'm trying to think who it was. I can't remember who it was. Anyway, they said, "Hey, Paul, I know you're working. Can you get someone to come in and relieve you? You're going to be detailed to the FEMA task force. We're going down to Haiti." And he says, "We need you to get a couple of guys for FDNY to head down there." So here I am calling people's houses at 2 o'clock in the morning. Calling their cell phones. Like, what the hell are you doing calling me at 2 o'clock in the morning? And a couple of guys were away, and they were upset because they missed it. Other guys, whoever picked up the phone went. Other guys who didn't pick up the phone, they didn't have a shot. So that's how it worked.
Oh, of course. You never knew. You never knew. And that was an experience like no other. Again, the sheer devastation and the resources of the land too. Again, similar to Dominican Republic in 1998 with Hurricane George, you're not talking about a land that has a lot, which is why it's essential that if you could send help, as much help as possible, you're going to go down there. And New York is the crossroads of the world. So you got a big Haitian community down there naturally. If there's a New York connection to be had, there's a FEMA presence from Task Force 1 to be able to be had as well. And you guys did great work down there. I think there's a great photo of a rescue of a kid from a building collapse following that earthquake.
Yeah, I was there. I was there with that. That was Kiko, I believe it was.
Yep.
His name was Kiko. Yeah.
Yeah, he's got his arms out like this, big smile.
Yeah. So he was trapped. I think he was either behind the sister or next to his sister. We got his sister out first, which a lot of people don't know. There was another one, and there was another sister. I believe it was a sister. It was a young girl who was DOA. She didn't make it. So I remember we covered the body with a sheet. So when Kiko and her sister, I can't remember the sister's name, came up, we didn't want them to see their sister, you know, in that type of situation where she was passed away. So, but yeah, that was a great effort, team effort. I remember, I think it was Chris Dunnick from 288 that was actually held up the baby, and they got the shot. I think it's Chris Dunnick that's actually holding. But anyway, it was a team effort. I'm not saying FDPD, everyone worked, and we worked well together, and that was a really, you know, we got that as a tip. Someone came to us and said, hey, you know, there's a trap kids at this location. And what the mother was doing, it was down, I don't know, maybe 15 feet, 20 feet. I can't remember how deep it was, but it was about 15, 20 feet. And the mother had taken this long bamboo pole and stuck it down there, and she was sending them water through the bamboo pole.
Wow.
So they could actually have water to hydrate themselves because they were so thirsty. And yeah, it was pretty wild. What a good idea on her part.
Yeah, a mother's love, right? You know,
Yeah.
Any resources to help her babies. I'm very glad she did that. That's cool. Yeah, I'm glad I asked you about that, because I'm like, I can't gloss over that. You went to Haiti in 2010. I remember that like it was yesterday. So I'm like, I had to ask, you know, and you had a couple of great stories to share from that time. I'll get to your work with the NFPA in a second, which started while you were still on the job. But Stu Kelsel's got a really good question. I'm going to get to it. And like I said, if you guys want to fire a question away, do so. You can also use the super chat if you want. He says, and I'm sure you can see it. Question for the lieutenant. Could you say what your most dangerous job was in HazMat, or the most surprising?
We had a couple of dangerous ones. I'm going to go with the most that had the potential to do some serious damage. And it was a surprise. And that was a nitric acid leak. You know, there was a couple of good ones. You know, we've had a couple of fires, propane fires in trucks where the propane was coming out. You got a full truck. You worried about an explosion or a bloody and things of that sort. But I want to go back to the nitric acid one. That one was in a location. It spilled all over. We wound up getting the people out. So the life threat was out, but the cleanup became an issue. And I remember talking to a gentleman with a PhD, right, who worked with the stuff.
Right.
So I go over with them. I said, all right, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to wear. Give me some feedback. The guy said, he goes, I have no idea. I have no emergency response at all. I have nothing to do with emergency response. I only work with this stuff. And that's when I realized, yeah. And that's when I realized, like, wow, I guess we actually know more than we think we know. And I tell firefighters that all the time, you know, that we take for granted the stuff that we know, and the stuff that is just common sense and so routine for us that everyone's like, oh, wow, I never would have thought of doing that. We're like, what do you mean? Something so simple. And I tell firefighters, you know a lot more than you think you know. You just don't know what you know.
Right. What's the old Dennis Smith line? I'm FDNY trained. I can do anything. He wasn't lying. He ain't lying.
Yeah. You figure ways to do it. You figure ways. You know, we had a unique one. Ironically, it was a battery, and this is before I got deep into the batteries.
Yep.
But short circuiting battery. They threw this battery, this X-ray machine out. It had a battery in it, and they had this hopper that come down and it crushed it, and it was arcing all over the place. And this metal piece had come down, and we couldn't get it out. And rescue one's there, and they're like, we can't lift this thing. So we had these low pressure, high lift bags that actually could actually push over a tanker truck full of, if it was full of gas, you really didn't want to push it over with full of gas, but it would actually take the weight of that thing and push it back onto its wheels. It was pretty interesting. So we wound up using that, and it worked like a charm. And a lot of guys there were some guys in HazMat like, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. And I said, no, we're going to give it a shot. And then after it worked, I kind of felt vindicated. So it was pretty unique. Anyway.
Well, of course. And, you know, it's a city of 8 million people. So there's no better training ground. The most unusual things that can happen will happen, as I've said many a time before on the program. So in terms of, like you said earlier, firefighters know more than they think. Definitely is the case in a city like New York, or any metropolis for that matter, where so many things can happen all at once, all in the same incident sometimes.
Mike, I just want to, you know, probably the most dangerous one that we went to was the in Riverside State Park, where they had a water treatment plant with chlorine, full fifth alarm fire going down there. The citywide tour commander was Joe Woznicker at the time. He wound up being a Bronx Borough commander later on. Woznicker knew me, and he said, hey, he goes, Paul, I want you to take you guys down. I want you to go down into the basement, take a look at those cylinders. Let me know, give me a report on those things. And, you know, we took a hose line down there, but we took a beating trying to get down those stairs because we were in the flu. We were in that heat was coming up at us, and we did what we did what we were supposed to do. It was difficult. It was difficult to actually give him a really good assessment, you know, with smoke all over, and but luckily there was no escape of the chlorine, which would have been pretty devastating if that would have happened.
Oh, for sure. For sure. That definitely is a dangerous one. We've been talking for almost an hour, and I almost forgot about your pictures. So let me get to your pictures because you sent some along. And there's some good ones. So we can talk about some of them, of course. This is HazMat 1's rig, which kind of looks like Rescue 1's, but it's a little bit different in its setup. And this is unique because you don't see rigs with that 2-window setup. Is that for extra? I imagine that's for extra equipment, right? Or am I wrong?
Yeah. So in the very first window that's right behind the driver there, that's the resource area. So there's a whole mess of books, and we have communications that we can really call a lot of different people. We have television sets back there. We can communicate with a lot of, you know, outside entities and things of that sort. But that's where a lot of the resource or the information gathering takes place, right in that back there. There's someone assigned to that. We got all these books. We have everything that's online that we can actually research. We got reach back people that we have a whole mess of numbers that we can call people in the event that it's something that's really unique that we haven't experienced before. So that's kind of like the brains of where we're making our decisions comes out of there. Mm-hmm. We get a lot of information in that particular area.
Oh, it looks like it. It's a beautiful rig too. It's very, very well designed. You need it. The more resources you have on a thing like that, the better. You never want to shortchange any unit in the FDNY, but especially one in Special Operations Command like HazMat. I believe, because I've seen this vehicle, well, I saw it in person down at Floyd Bennett Field, this picture here, which is the emergency rescue vehicle for the NYPD Emergency Service Unit. For those of you that are listening to this on the audio side, is this the MSOC conference?
This is, I believe, no, I think this is over at the tennis stadium. And I'm with Danny O'Shea, who ironically used to be a emergency service guy.
Really? Really?
Yeah, Danny, great guy, wonderful, wonderful guy, very well liked. You know, and he came over, but even the guys from ESU still liked him. As far as I know, they liked him. He was a good man.
That's a first, Paul. I've never heard of a guy being. That's the best. Talk about best of both worlds, ESU and the FDNY. It's pretty cool. If you have his contact information, put me in touch with him because I definitely want to get that guy on the show. And I like this picture a lot. Is this you and your boys?
Yeah, that's a picture. It was in Jersey. I can't remember who was it that passed away in Ramapo. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we were at a funeral. Guess what? I had to babysit during that. Not babysit. You know, I had my kids that weekend.
Right.
And Mike, for a line of duty death in the FDNY, they don't care if you have your kids or what. The kids are in strollers. Firefighters turn out.
Yeah.
And they honor those. They do not miss a line of duty death. Bring your child. And you know, it's just kind of letting you know that like it's a big deal. And there are attendance taken. If you don't show up, like, where were you? Did you have a death in the family? Were you sick? You know, did you have a heart attack? Someone, you know, anyway, they expect people to be there, and sure enough, that's what I had to do. You know?
Oh no, of course, and that's very much true. You know, that's and it's natural, of course. Death in the family, as you said, in this particular case, the fire service family. You better have a very good reason for not showing up. You better have a very serious situation going on in your own right if you're not going to turn out for a funeral.
Yeah.
So, you know,
You
glad you
better be
mentioned
working.
that. This is you on the fire floor. I remember getting salty using this picture. This is you at an operation, I'm sure.
Yeah, this is in Manhattan. I know it was in Manhattan, but I can't remember the box that we're at. But I know usually when we show up, most of the time, either battalion or the HazMat battalion is usually waving us in, and we kind of go through a powwow with them. And you know, I've always was good, Mike, as far as whenever I dealt with a chief officer, I would always be very respectful and say, Chief, you know, here's some of the things that you may want to consider. Because I never want to overstep my boundaries by saying, hey, you know, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. I always had a good delivery by saying this is something you may want to deliver. And I think that a lot of chiefs respected that with me.
Oh yeah, diplomacy is key. Diplomacy is key, especially when it comes to respecting the chain of command in a paramilitary organization like the FDNY. A couple more pictures here before we get back to your career. Who are you with here?
This is John Nykiel. John passed away suddenly. Wonderful man. Really, yeah, breaks my heart. He passed away 3 or 4 years ago. John ran the master exercise program for the fire department. So any master exercise planning or anything like that, John was in charge of that. And that really took off, I'd say, after 9/11. They did all of these tabletop exercises and all these full-scale exercises. And John was in charge of that whole thing. But just a really decent man there that had passed away. This is, I guess, it's St. Patrick's Day. I see some green in the back. Right? Yeah, this is St. Patrick's Day.
And you can see the kilts too, so I'm assuming that's the case. A couple more pictures before I get to your career, of course. So this is this the Marine? One of the Marines.
This is Marine One, and beautiful boat. So when I got back to SOC, they could put you anywhere. You know, I worked in a couple of squads. One day I was scheduled to work in a rescue, and they said, no, we're going to grab a squad officer, and you're going to go to a squad and detail into the rescue. So, you know, it would have been pretty funny. But, you know, I think I had a lot of respect from the guys from the rescue companies. But I worked on the boats, and the boats would use me a lot. You know, like, hey, is he available? Like, and I remember doing one of my first tours in the boats in Marine One, which is in Manhattan on the west side. And I said, all right, guys, what are we doing? They're like, hey, boss, just so you know, you're here for the ride and making sure that we get paid. And that's when I learned that, okay, let me shut my mouth and say nothing.
There you go. There you go. And of course, for those of you that are listening to this, the boat is named 343. That's in memory of the 343 firefighters killed on 9/11, which segues perfectly into this next picture. Is this you doing this at Ground Zero on the ladder?
It is not.
Okay.
It's not me doing that. No. But I just wanted to throw a picture in there. You know, obviously, 9/11 should always be remembered. A lot of the people that were there should, you know, have no problem saying, hey, yeah, that was just a big event for the city of New York and the United States of America. And we pulled together, you know, the country really pulled together at that particular time when we were very divided now. But it was such the good thing that came out of 9/11 is just how we really all just came together in a really good way. And the world was so good to the United States. You know, I just thought it was a picture that we should be showing. And also, you know, I want to bring up, I lost a good friend. You know, he was in my wedding party, and he probably one of my best friends, Timmy Haskell.
Yeah, good fun.
And Mrs. Haskell, Maureen, lost 2 sons that day, Timmy and Tommy.
Wow.
And Tommy, I think, was 36, 35, 36, maybe 34. Whatever the case may be, Tommy was young, and he was making battalion chief. He would have been one of the younger.
At age?
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool.
Tommy went up the ladder extremely, extremely fast. He was the captain working in 132. I wasn't sure if he was assigned to 132. I think he was working in 132 that day. Timmy was working in Squad 18, and both of them were killed. And you know, when Timmy, they found Timmy very early on 9/11. His body was pretty much intact. You know, he was recognizable. And I remember going to the captain of 18. I think it was Brian Smith. Brian was there temporarily. Anyway, I went over and I said, "Hey guys, you guys are still in the rescue mode. I'll take care of Timmy's funeral." I said, "I'll take care of it." So I call up our funeral desk. They formed the funeral desk, and I said, "Hey, listen, you know, I'm going to try to help with the funeral with Timmy Haskell." And the guy, the captain on the other side, he goes, "Paul, you're on your own. We're not sending anyone." We were still in a rescue mode, and they were like, "I don't know what to tell you," right? So I went out and I spoke to, I wanted to get someone for playing taps. So I went to Seaford High School, and I went to the music teacher, and he's like, "What? You want what? Oh my God, we'll definitely do this." You know, because we had no one to play. I was trying to do traditional as best as possible. I spoke to Mrs. Haskell, worked for the courts. So I spoke to them to see if they can get the Emerald Society there. So I try to bring everything together to try to bring it in. But guess what? The FDNY pipe band, a couple of them, wound up showing up. And they wound up going to every single person's funeral that passed away on 9/11. Or memorial service.
Yeah, that, and I heard nothing but good things about both. But I mean, I think John Moran was another one that he made battalion chief really, really young in his career. So it's such a crying shame, as I talked about with Chief Jonas, guys like that. Oriole Palmer was another one. These guys would have been, they were rising stars in the department. They were well on their way. They'd probably be in the brain trust, right now, had it not been for that day. That day changed the trajectory of a lot of things, unfortunately. And that's not diminishing the brain trust. It's there now. They're doing a great job.
Yep.
But man, those guys, chief of department material, chief of operations material, think about Terry Hatton, right? In Rescue One, same thing. There's no doubt in my mind that guy would have been chief of department someday.
Paolillo is another one.
Yeah,
was chief. Yep.
Yeah, his brother was the NYPD detective. He passed from 9/11 cancer a few years ago. So it's just tough. It's why I'm glad you included that picture in there. We can talk about it a little bit. Another interesting question from Stu before I get to the NFPA, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on lithium-ion batteries too before the rapid fire, which is one last question for the lieutenant. The years immediately following 9/11, we kind of touched on this a little bit, but we can expand here. How difficult was it to implement the changes to operations, specifically, I guess he means in HazMat?
Yeah, so we had we had a brand new crew. So we were able to change the operations a little easier because we weren't getting old timers fighting us against it. So there was a lot of new people that were coming in to fill those voids because a lot of people left. There was a lot of overtime. There were some guys that were just, PSTD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They PTSD. They left. So we had a brand new crew, and we were able to make a lot of changes much easier as a result of that. But that's a great question. And we did. We made some serious changes. Like even when we would go outside the, you saw the rig before. When you would come out of the back of the rig, there would always be a sign up there, watch the secondary devices. Always being the secondary devices. That was something that we had there. Yeah. The guys at Squad 288 always had other things going on, which was good. So we were always cognizant of trying to be situational awareness.
Oh, that's key because, of course, you go down there responding to the first device if something has already gone off. And we've seen this, unfortunately, play out across the world in different scenarios. First responders are there tending to the wounded, tending to the dead even. And then the secondary device is there because someone evil is watching from a distance. Okay, now. And boom, the second device comes into play. So that's something, especially in a city like New York, where there's been a lot of close calls. and of course, major tragedies have happened, such as 9/11. It's good, and that's the beauty of the FDNY. And I love whenever guys come on and talk about the training, especially those who were fire officers in any rank. That I've always admired. You're not a step ahead; you're about 5 or 6, and you need to be. Look where you work.
You know, Mike, and I want to be very clear on this. FDNY did not mess with any bombs. We stood back and we let the bomb squad in. We didn't want any part of it. So there was a tremendous amount of respect for the bomb squad, for the NYPD, and we allowed, we not allowed, we just stayed back and listened to their direction. If they said move back 500 feet, we pretty much were going back 500 feet,
Yep. Yeah, I'm good on that.
Yeah.
I'm set. Bomb. You tell me to move back 20 feet, I'm moving back 1,000. So definitely good on that. And I respect those guys. Although it is good. This is one thing I did mention to a bomb squad friend of mine who was also a former Truck One cop, Paulie Perricone. Good guy. And that the more I talk, and I feel the same way talking to you guys in the FDNY, the more I talk to you guys as a civilian, the better I feel, because the more I know what to do. That if these situations happen, I'm like, oh, I remember this from episode X, Y, and Z. Paul Rogers said this. You know what? Let me do it. Now's a great time to apply that advice. So it's good. It's always educational.
Yeah. I listen to some of the people on your podcast, and I hear some of the stories. I'm like, oh, that's really put that in my brain. Not that I'm responding anymore, but good information. The young kids should be listening to some of the stuff. This is really good information that these guys give it out.
Oh yeah, it's always a wealth of knowledge. Anytime I talk to anybody from either side, FDNY or NYPD. Best of the Bravest, Volume 38. Our guest tonight is Lieutenant Paul Rogers, who spent a lot of his career in the Special Operations Command with the HazMat, Hazardous Materials Company 1, which is housed out in Queens alongside Squad 288, as we mentioned earlier. So quickly before I get to Lithium-ion, which will be the bulk of this show before the rapid fire, like I said, working with the NFPA, it's interesting. Their measures are very, very effective. They're always, I feel like it's an organization, especially now working in a firehouse and dealing with a lot of their releases, press releases, that is, they have their finger on the pulse, and not just in one particular market, everywhere. They're looking to see what's the flavor and what's the common emergency or even uncommon emergencies in every particular territory of the United States of America specifically. So with that being said, the opportunity to work with them is a great one. And what specifically did you want to focus on, and what was your role initially with the NFPA when you came on?
So yeah, I didn't work for the NFPA, and I also want to throw in the UL, Underwriters Laboratory. They both were very effective in some of these regulations that we put in place for the mine matters that we'll talk about later on. But I didn't work for them. I worked with them.
Right.
And then I was put on a committee that they have. And their committees that they have are from people from all over the world that sit on. It's a group of subject matter experts that discuss different things with different life safety features. Could be a fire alarm, could be a sprinkler system, it could be wood buildings, whatever they have a standard on. They're the ones who write these standards for people to follow, prescriptive codes, so people follow to try to make sure when they're using this or doing something, it's safe.
No, it's needed to have that many different voices in the room, some from the same general geographical area. And thanks for that correction, by the way. Some not. Again, we talked about constant education in the fire service, both for civilians and for first responders alike. Being that in that room with different voices from different parts of the world, even if not already the country, how did that enhance your mindset as a fire officer in New York City?
Yeah. Well, I was a little intimidated. Now, when they put a committee together, they want different backgrounds there, right? Someone from the insurance company, someone from a plumbing company, or whatever it may be. So they have all these different categories. I represent the fire service. So, you had these, I was always the dopiest guy in the room. You had these PhDs over there and everything like that. So you were a little intimidated by that. Until one PhD grabbed me and he says, "Hey, Paul," he goes, "why aren't you speaking up?" Yeah, I said, "Tom, I don't know if I'm worthy of speaking up." He goes, "Well, do you have anything to say?" I go, "I got a lot to say, but I don't want to sound stupid." Anyway, make a long story short, this is why I tell firefighters, you know a lot more than you think you do, because the moment that I started to speak up, and people are like, "Oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, I didn't know that." Oh, that's what goes out there in the field? All of these, not all of them, some of these people, they don't go to emergency response. They're writing prescriptive codes for the emergency responders, but they've never were emergency responders. So they're living in a fairy tale world, and they're living in ideological world. We bring in practicality, and we actually say that doesn't go on. That's not what goes on. And here's what happens at 3 o'clock in the morning. And here's what we need at 3 o'clock in the morning. And who's going to come and help us out at 3 o'clock in the morning? And who's going to do this? And and the next thing you know, their eyes are wide open. Like, we didn't realize that. So it's important to have a voice. And this is why from around the country, I always tell people, get involved with these NFPA standards. Get involved with them, because you have a voice. And there's some sharp people out there. Same thing with the PD, with the Department of Justice and their protocols. PD needs to get there and make sure that they speak.
Every voice matters, and sometimes the people that have the most prestige in terms of title, in terms of degrees, may not necessarily be, I should say, the voice in the room that needs to be heard from. Sometimes it's the person that's more streetwise. Maybe he or she doesn't have all the degrees in the world, but they have the experience as you did. And that's the person that you want to hear from more than anything. It's why I said earlier, it's good to have different voices in the room. You get the procedural aspect, and their knowledge is important too. I'm not putting them down, but you also have someone there who's lived it. And that's a recipe for success, as long as people are willing to work together.
Mike, we went to a substation, underground substation or something like that for Con Edison. The white helmets didn't help me. I wanted the boots on the ground. How does this thing work? What do we need to be concerned about? Where are we going here? We're going to do a joint entry with you guys. Those are the people who actually touch it, feel it, know all the different things about it. Those are the guys that I used to sort out when I was making an entry into something I didn't know.
No, that's always the right play, of course. And of course, them working with it day to day, it's good to lean on that. Because sometimes, and this happens in both PD and FD, not just in New York, but anywhere in general, across the country, across the world. Well, we're the police. We know what to do. Well, we're the fire department. We know what to do. In most cases, they do. But there's some in emergencies like that where, no, ask the guy or the gal that works with it every day, because you may have an idea, but there might be a nook and cranny in there that you're not familiar with, and it's going to throw you for a loop. And the more knowledge you have, the safer you're going to be. And I'm preaching to the choir here, as I'm sure this is something you told your firefighters many a time. The safer you're going to be, the safer your men and women are going to be too.
That is correct. And I used to have my own little things that I used to do when, for instance, if there was an explosion, we were on the scene.
Yeah.
I told everyone I wanted them back at the rig. I want to physically see you. Otherwise, I'm sending our team after you, and you're going to waste our resources. I want you back at the rig. We regroup, and then we'll go back in. That was only if there was an explosion while we're at the scene.
Smart. No, of course, it's needed. It's needed. And it may seem annoying to a guy that's hard charging. Firemen want to be in there. They don't want to get pulled off unless it's absolutely necessary. But hey, guys need to be safe.
And Mike, radio traffic, no one's going to get their transmission through.
Exactly.
So I said, physically come back to the rig. We're going to go face to face, because you're not going to be able to transmit.
Mm-hmm. No, and I'm glad you did that. I wanted to get to this now, because this is something that I'll say class will be in session here, because even though you retired from the FDNY in 2018, I can't even ask you, well, when did you know it was time to retire? Because even in quote unquote retirement, you're one of those guys that you retired in name only. You're still so active in the private sector, teaching on these things. You're still so involved. The fire service has never stopped for you. Hopping on the rig has stopped, but everything else has kept on going. And that's why I wanted to bring up lithium-ion batteries. And it's timely. Fatal fire in Chinatown. 4 people have been killed. 2 people were injured in that. I don't know if the death toll has risen from that fire, but last I heard it was 4. This year alone, 13 people have died as a result of lithium-ion battery fires. It's a big problem nationwide. It's especially a big problem in New York City with the amount, and of course, the unusual situation that not every city has 8 million people living in it, or is 5 cities merged into one. So from your perspective, as someone who lived it, as a boots on the ground firefighter, later fire officer in HazMat for the bulk of your career, and as someone who's still so heavily involved in the private sector, I don't know how else to ask the question. 2-part question. 1, what is going on? And 2, how do you see it from your vantage point? And what can we do? What should we as civilians know?
Difficult question, Mike. Number one, I sit on the U.S. Department of Transportation FAA Lithium-ion Safety Committee, and I've been on there since just before my retirement. So 2018, the pilots union was very concerned about the amount of batteries that they were bringing over from outside the United States, from Asia. And they knew that these batteries were, poor quality batteries, and they classified them as counterfeit batteries. That's what they called them, counterfeit batteries, because they were out of spec. They weren't listed batteries. They didn't go through any testing, made with poor quality materials. So when you make poor quality materials, you're going to wind up having failures. So all of these batteries now are making their way into these consumer products. They got a little bit of time on them, and they are starting to degrade, and we're seeing the results of that now. But the FAA was concerned about these batteries having problems on the planes, on the cargo planes, and on the passenger jets, on the passenger planes in the cabins. So we were talking about draconian regulation, and not we it wasn't practical, but it was brought up that, hey, maybe we should not have anyone bring any type of lithium-ion battery, period. No phone, no computer. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
It wasn't going to happen.
Yeah,
but
not in today's day and age.
No, but credit to the pilots union for making this aware, bringing this awareness out there. But the reason I bring this up, Mike, is because now this stuff has made its way into the supply chain in the United States of America, and now we're seeing the results of that. We're seeing poor quality batteries, poor quality chargers, poor quality inverters, and we're also seeing the maintenance of these things. What I mean by maintenance is the standard of care. Standard of care of these things. Lithium-ion batteries, I always refer to them as the Goldilocks batteries. Everything needs to be just right. It needs to be just right. If not, you're going to have a problem with it. Look, you leave your phone out in the sun. What does it do?
It overheats. You can't charge it.
It stops processing. It's trying to save itself from going into thermal runaway. It tells you, take me out of the sun. And that's exactly. So they don't even have these good quality BMSs, battery management systems, which look at the state of health of these things. So anyway, it's a real technical subject. I don't want to get too deep into it. But what I'm saying is that these poor quality batteries that are made their way out into the United States, and where it is a problem, and we don't know how to correct it. Right? How do you regulate that? If you go onto not to throw Amazon, but you go onto a website and you can see a battery, an e-bike that's going to cost you $3,000 versus $1,500. Which one are you going to go with?
Well, of course, you're going to go for the cheaper one. That's everyone.
Yeah, it's a socioeconomic problem, right? Yeah. Because people are trying to make money. You take a lithium-ion battery away from a guy who has a delivery service. He's making 10 deliveries a day with no battery. He's making 40 deliveries a day with the battery. So you're taking away some people's livelihood. It's such a hard balance that the fire department has right now, and it's really hard to regulate.
And you don't want to get draconian either, like you said earlier, to where I know the fire marshals had an initiative where they were going to shops and shut them down, which is good. But even then, and I'm not knocking the operation, it's a prudent strategy from the standpoint of targeting the obvious targets and getting them out of business before something like Chinatown happens, where that store had numerous citations for violations and manifested itself in this tragedy particularly. But I feel like even with an operation like that, it's only scratching the surface, because you can't regulate purchases. You'd have to look through every online purchase. You'd have to go through every street vendor in New York City that sells these e-bikes, for example, and see if they have a license or not. And even in a city like New York that has a budget in the billions, it's impossible to dedicate enough manpower or even technological power to genuinely curb that problem. And that's where you mentioned, that's what concerns me the most, that if you guys, with all the knowledge you have, haven't been able to crack it to a deeper level yet, well, then, Paul, who can? And how can they?
Yeah, it's becoming a black eye for the industry itself, or anyone that uses lithium-ion batteries, right? This is consumer products that we see where the problems are. We're not really witnessing them in the electric vehicles. Although some people say, yeah, electric vehicles are going on fire. Well, if you go 90 miles an hour and you crack it open, I can guarantee it's going to go on fire, right? I mean, that's a no-brainer. So again, go back to standard of care. These energy storage systems that are stationary, we're not seeing, major issues with them, but the consumer products. And Mike, where is the problem? We see a lot of them taking place in residential units, whether it's a apartment building, a private dwelling. This particular one happened to be in a bike shop. Yeah. So, but we're seeing a lot of them, and unfortunately we're losing some good people as a result of it, which is just so sad to see. I read it and I shake my head, and I'm not a negative guy. I try to be really positive, but I also know reality. The reality is these batteries are out there, and it's going to be hard for you to catch them.
Yeah, no, and you know what? I remember when you were on Getting Salty back in January talking about this, which was a great episode that I got the honor to produce. And I was just listening to this in the back room, and it's great to hear it again about 5, almost 6 months later here in June, in that one of the things that you mentioned, or actually was a picture that you showed, where it was an apartment fire where a lithium battery was the main cause. Looking at that photo, I could still see it in my head. You would have thought a bomb went off. There was an explosion in the apartment. That's how powerful these things are. And I go back to Chief Lieb yesterday on Salty. He doesn't own an e-bike, but he mentioned if I did, the only reason I don't have one, of course, he doesn't live in New York City, he lives on Long Island, I don't have a safe place to charge it. You don't want to charge it in your house. You don't want to charge it in your garage. Even if your garage is separate from the house, there's valuable property in there. It's one of those, as the old saying in the world goes, by the grace of God go I, where you charge it, you plug it in, you hope nothing happens. But the reality is there's always that chance. It quite literally feels like a ticking technological time bomb. And the concerning part additionally is here we are with all these technological resources in 2023 to achieve just about anything. But this is the one thing, this is the one nugget we still have yet to crack.
Yes. Mike, I was out in Kansas City teaching battery class, and these guys were, the firefighters were telling me that there was a guy who would pick up all of these batteries that needed to be charged, these scooters, bring them to an apartment. He rented out an apartment, had, excuse me, had extension cords all over the place, and he was charging those batteries. Within a week, he paid for the apartment rent already and the electricity, and everything else was good. Everything else was profit for him. So can you imagine the fire load in that apartment if you have one of these things that go on fire?
Someone's going to get killed.
Live there?
Yeah. Someone's going to get killed. I mean, it's literally a tragedy waiting to happen. The last thing I'll ask you on this particular subject before we get to the rapid fire is, again, some of this stuff is common sense, of course, like with anything in life. Some of these products, like the phone, we use every day, and other household mechanisms or other stuff that's in the job space too, that's just standard use. But the more, how would I word it? The deeper things going below the surface level. What should civilians know about these batteries beyond what's already been said? What awareness should we have? What should we not do when it comes to lithium-ion battery use to minimize tragedies like Chinatown or any of the other tragedies that have resulted in these 13 lives in New York City alone being lost this year?
So, Mike, there's this thing called a listing, which means that the battery has gone through a whole mess of different types of testing to prove safety. And it's usually Underwriters Laboratory will give it a listing for the product battery itself. Your refrigerator, if you go into your refrigerator, you will see it has a listing. That listing is saying, hey, this thing is safe to go into your house, and it has this material in the back of it, right? It has Freon in the back of it, but you're putting that into your house and you don't have any issues with that.
I think it twice.
Yeah, the reason that we put it in there, first of all, we're comfortable with it. But second of all, there's a listing to show that that product is safe for what it's supposed to do inside a dwelling. Well, the same applies for these batteries. So they've gone through some sort of testing to make sure that the material that they're using is good quality material. The charging mechanisms are good that are attached with it. As I said, the Goldilocks. The charging mechanism has to actually match up with the battery that it's charging. You don't go to the local gas station and get one of those cheap chargers for your phone, even though we've all done it, right? We've left our charger home.
Guilty.
Yeah. It degrades the battery, number one, so you're going to lose life in the battery. But another big thing is that it may charge at a rate of X, where the battery is expecting a rate of Y, and it starts to degrade it, and that as a result of that degradation, you'll get the battery material, what they call a separator, will start to have problems, and then you'll get what they call an internal short circuit, and that becomes a problem. But the bottom line is this: is that we need to have listings. And I want to be very clear on this too. Just because it has a listing, it doesn't mean that you can bang it all over the place and not take care of it. It just means that it's a better quality battery. And I'll never say that just because it has a listing, it will never fail. But the risk involved with it is significantly reduced as a result of that.
Right. And risk reduction and mitigation is the name of the game these days. And I think that segues perfectly into what Stu Kelsall has in the chat. And for those of you that submitted other questions, I apologize. Like I said, I just try to make sure that we cover as much as we can with whatever guests we have. And Stu's question is this: does anyone know if there's been any progress, and you would know, I'm assuming, regarding containment and or extinguishing methods? And before you answer that question, I remember you mentioning in that aforementioned Salty episode, there was incidents like a car fire where they're putting water on. It was a Tesla. Wasn't extinguishing the fire because of the battery.
Well, first of all, when it's outdoors, what are you saving? Right?
Fair enough.
But what we do know is that the using water will cool down the process, right? And you may actually stop the process, but it probably will temporarily, because once you have a cell that's right next to each finger being a cell, once you have a cell that starts to heat up, the heat from that cell transfers to this cell, starts to degrade the interior of the battery with the separator. We get an internal short circuit in that battery, in that cell, and so on and so on and so on. So even though you may stop the process, the damage may be already done in that cell there. So you'll get a reignition later on. Very, very common. We've seen that quite frequently. But there are going to be cases that it may be underground garage that you're going to have to do something. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're going to have a collapse with an underground garage fire with a very, very hot fire from the lithium-ion battery.
Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of those. Even here in New Haven, Connecticut, we have quite a few parking garages underground, above ground. Look what just happened recently in Manhattan. That's definitely another thing to keep an eye on, where property is worth saving too. Although you're going to have to adjust your methods when HazMat's involved. The hour and a half has flown by. This has been a really good conversation. I've enjoyed it a lot. I'm glad I finally got you on. And it's now time for how we always end, which is rapid fire. 5 hit-and-run questions from me, 5 answers from you. You can, of course, say pass if you want. If you don't have an answer that springs to mind, are you ready?
I'm ready to go, Mike. I think I'm ready.
Okay. So first, either as a cop or as a fireman, funniest call you ever responded to?
I can't say it on the air.
Tell me off the air. You can tell me off the air.
Sorry about that.
No, it's good. It's good. I'll hear it off the air. Second, funniest colleagues between either department that you worked with.
Funniest colleagues I ever worked with? Mm-hmm. Probably Joe Napoli. Joe Napoli.
That name.
Yeah.
There you
Joe
go.
Napoli was one of the funniest guys I worked with.
There you go. I've heard that name before. So yeah, another guy should probably get on the show. Third, again, between either department, most uplifting call you ever responded to.
The most uplifting call, it dealt with tragedy, but we wound up bringing people back to life, a full family in Flushing, Queens. The mother and the kids, the father was a court officer. They wound up coming back to the firehouse when they all recovered out of the hospital. That was a lot of fun, and we were so happy to see them. Everyone fully recovered. They were out.
Was it carbon monoxide?
Carbon monoxide, yeah. Oh. But it was a fire. It was smoke.
Okay.
We worked on them.
Great. Well, that's awesome. Glad to hear that. All right. Fourth, and you can say multiple here because some people's like, I can't pick one. I understand. Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
My favorite bar or restaurant in New York City is probably DiNapoli's.
Heard about it.
I like the Italian food.
I don't blame you. No, it's Italian cuisine. I enjoy it myself. So yeah, I've heard about DiNapoli's, another place on the list of many places in the city that I definitely have to try at some point. And fifth and finally, I'm going to tweak this question. I'm going to ask it a little bit differently than I normally do because you wore both hats in your career in New York City in civil service. If you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, or even somebody coming on the job today, first, what would you tell a cop, or what would you tell Paul Rogers, the cop? Young version of him, of course. And what would you tell Paul Rogers, the fireman? First, the cop.
Yeah, as a cop, I would say that it's important that you interact with the community. I was forced to do it. I didn't want to do it. But as I learned, that was extremely important to interact with the community, to make sure that most of the people in the community are on your side. They just can't come out and say it, but they really are on your side in the NYPD. And I mean that. As far as the fire service, probably what I would tell myself is training. A lot of people don't like to train. A lot of people don't like to go out of their comfort zone. Training, I thought, was the best thing in the fire department, and I loved it. You know, you would be brought down by other guys like, oh my God, we're going for training again today, and then it would kind of like ruin the mood, and then you were afraid to say anything like, oh, I'm looking forward to this, but but training is the key to success in the fire department. The key to keeping yourself safe. I've learned so much from training and from listening to experienced firefighters.
Of course, you know, it's a treasure trove, you know, and it doesn't even have to be anybody that has a particular rank, just somebody, a senior man in a firehouse, which is sometimes all the rank you need. You know, lean on him, lean on her, and learn the most that you can.
Well, I just got to add one last thing, Mike.
Go ahead. Sure.
Joe Angelini, you know, right? Was he 62 years old?
63.
63. Joe Angelini cleaning the tools at 63 years old and never questioned it, never had a problem with it, right? Here's a guy that really would do the menial task and was the most senior person probably on the job.
Yeah.
And doing the menial task, never expected anyone to take care of him. He did what he needed to do. I found that to be an amazing thing when I heard about that. I did not witness it, but when I heard about it, I always remembered that. Like, wow, that's impressive. I tell my sons that.
No, of course. And one thing I wanted to add about Joe, now that you mention it, I think this was Tony Tedeschi when CBS did that great Company of Heroes special, which is on YouTube in its entirety for those of you that want to find it. Joe, of course, for those of you that don't know, and I know my sister's probably wondering, who's Joe Angelini because she's watching tonight. That's one of the firefighters from Rescue 1 who perished sadly on 9/11. And he was the oldest firefighter. No, well, Bill Feehan was the oldest. He was the second oldest firefighter to die that day. And Tony Tedeschi said, you know, because Joe was coming up on the retirement age, he would have been eligible in 2003. He would have aged out in 2003. Joe, if there was no age cap, how long would you want to do this job? And Joe said, you know, Tony, I'd like to do this for 50 years. 50 years. And Tony said, I just want to live 50 years. He wanted to fight fires for 50 years. It was in him. He had a son on the fire patrol. He had another son who unfortunately also perished that day. But Joe's legacy is definitely still strong. And that guy, man, at 62, 63, he could give any young guy a run for his money. Puffing on a cigarette and all, Joe Angelini always got the job done.
Yeah. And Tony Tedeschi, there's another sharp guy himself.
Yeah. I'd like to get him on if I can at some point. He worked a lot in 288. Thanks for everyone for tuning in tonight. Paul, stick around. We'll say our goodbyes off the air, of course. Before we go, anything that you want to shout out or anyone?
No, thank Mike. And again, I do watch some of your podcasts and some of the people. It's an honor for me to be on your show with the people and the caliber of people that you brought on. And to me, to be put in that same situation is, I feel pretty good about it. So I do thank you for inviting me. Appreciate that.
Thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure for me. I learn a lot. Either way, like I said earlier, and I'm not kidding, whether it be PD or FD or some of the federal law enforcement I've had on, I'm always learning and I'm always putting that in the memory bank. This is good stuff to know. And we definitely got a lot of good information tonight. You guys know I'm always afraid to shout out at the end because there's so many of you and I feel bad if I miss someone. So just know as a collective, I appreciate every single one of you. Thanks for tuning in. And I hope I gave you a good show tonight. Paul, thanks again for highlighting such great information and sharing your career with us. And like I said, stick around. We'll talk off the air. So coming up next in the Mike and Raven podcast, I think it's still on. I got to confirm it. We could always pivot if it's not. But it should be this Tuesday. Dan Murphy, retired NYPD sergeant out of the Major Case Squad and Joint Terrorism Task Force. He was an excellent sergeant and detective in both. And he had a lot of interesting cases in his 20-year career. Did you know him? Seems like you do.
No, I was thinking Dan Murphy from Rescue 2, but Dan Murphy, I don't know Dan Murphy from the NYPD.
Oh, I've heard of Dan Murphy from Rescue 2 too, as well. So another guy I should probably get on. But Dan Murphy from the NYPD will be here. He's also the co-host of the Gold Shields podcast, alongside his former partner in the NYPD and now in the podcasting world, retired Detective Tom Smith. And June 30th is a surprise. I wore him down long enough. I'll tell you who it is, Paul, off the air. But I annoyed him long enough to where he's finally going to do it. He's looking to get out of it. He's not. So I'll announce that as it gets closer, but it should be fun next Friday, 7 o'clock. You'll have a lot of fun with this particular guest. In the meantime, this has been Volume 38 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. On behalf of retired FDNY HazMat Lieutenant Paul Rogers, I am Mike Colón. We will see you next time, and have a great rest of your night, everybody. Take care. Enjoy your weekend. Be safe. Take care.